Well, shall we?
Recording in progress.
Well, let's call the meeting to order. Thank you all for being here tonight. Would somebody like to start with the Planning Commission land acknowledgement?
Sure, be glad to do that.
Perfect.
We'd like to acknowledge we are on the traditional land of a rich and diverse group of Native peoples who have called this area home for more than 10,000 years. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the descendants of these Native peoples who are still here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can we have a look at the draft agenda and entertain a motion to approve the agenda? Unless there's any questions or concerns?
Move to approve.
So
I'll
moved.
second.
Seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the agenda is approved. We also had in the meeting packs a copy of the minutes from the March 11th meeting. Has everybody had a chance to review those?
Yes.
Any concerns or edits to any of them?
No.
Is there a motion to approve?
I'll motion to approve them.
Okay, moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. Next, we have our next meeting date. That is scheduled for Tuesday, June 10th. As I had shared previously, I will not be here at that meeting, but are there others who are not planning to be here, or will we have a quorum?
I'll be here.
I'll be here. Perfect. Cherie, will you be able to attend?
Yes. Yes. Ooh. Yes.
And you'll be able to-
Yes. 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 Yes.
Terrific.
Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Is that
Not-
better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a learning experience for us being in this room. We're normally in a conference room downstairs, so this is all new for us. So then we'll stick with that meeting date, and then perhaps Yana, you can chair the meeting, and we should be good to go. All right. So the next item on the agenda is public hearings. So we're supposed to have a presentation or public hearing on the middle housing and ADU code amendments that have been shared in the packet. Mark, are we expecting one of the consultants to present that?
Yes, Chair. Kirsten is available online from SCJ. She has some initial slides to kind of kick off this staff presentation for the hearing.
Terrific. Well, let's turn it over to Kirsten.
Do we need to open the hearing officially?
Oh, yes. I assume. Okay.
That's you.
So the public hearing is open.
All right. And are we starting with staff or with the consultant?
Yeah, no, it's appropriate. We can leave the public hearing open. This is all on the record. She has at least 6 or 7 slides to kick it off and learn what we're doing here tonight before public comment.
Terrific.
All right, thank you. Kirsten Peterson with SCJ Alliance. And can you hear me? Want to make sure about that. Okay, it kicked me out for just a moment when you promoted me to panelist, so wanted to make sure. So as Mark said, we've gone together through just a really brief presentation, what we want to give you for the record. I know that later on the agenda, there will be opportunity for some different types of discussion related to this. But can you see this PowerPoint middle housing update?
Yes.
Okay, great. So real quick slides, we're just going to go ahead and go over just for the record, an overview of the middle housing state mandates. You've heard them before, so we'll keep it brief. Talk about the tier 3 requirements related to middle housing, the subdivision requirements, and then some procedural requirements related to adopting the new code. So as many of you already know, there's some state mandates that came down the line related to middle housing and ADUs and subdivisions. So those are through House Bills 1110, 1337, and 2321. So simply requiring the cities to update zoning to allow middle housing types and increase density in residential areas. Cities must allow 2 accessory dwelling units on all lots that are located in zoning districts that also allow single-family zone or homes. And then cities are also required to update their subdivision code to allow for unit lot subdivisions and 0 lot line subdivisions. Real brief update. So how does and why does this impact Lake Forest Park? So you've been designated a tier 3 city. We've talked about what that means in the past. I've included a copy of the deadline chart from the Department of Commerce that states that Lake Forest Park must adopt middle housing requirements by June 30th, 2025. Failure to do so by the deadline means that the city is going to be subject to the model ordinance developed by the Department of Commerce. So that's what this has all been about. Understanding what the code requirements are, what's mandated, and then incorporating it into your code for your consideration. So the state of Washington does define what middle housing is. They give this long definition that is also included in your new code updates. The items in red are the ones that are required to be included for tier 3 cities that can allow 2 units per lot. It's these duplexes, stacked flats, courtyard apartments, and cottage housing. A little bit more information on that right here, where this comes from the Department of Commerce webpage. There's these 9 middle housing types, and the ones highlighted are the 4 that are applicable to Lake Forest Park. And they're the ones that the state feels can be reasonably built in a 2 unit per lot configuration. And then real quickly, you have a lot of materials in your packet. You've discussed this over several meetings, just discussing the process here. You guys are holding a planning commission meeting tonight, which is required for any text amendments to your code. You will make a recommendation to city council, who will hold at least 1 public hearing before taking action. Per code, we've prepared a report. Your staff has done notices. And then when it gets to city council, they can approve, modify, remand, or deny the amendment. And at that point, Mark and I have agreed that we are going to conclude the presentation because you've had so many opportunities to review this in the past, but we do have additional slides to respond to comments from Commerce and commission members that we will discuss on a different agenda item. That concludes my presentation for now, but I stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Terrific. Mark, was there anything that city staff wanted to add to the presentation at this point, or?
Not for the presentation, but with for item 9A, mission discussion.
Terrific. All right, so at this point, we've had the staff presentation. Are there any immediate questions from planning commissioner members about the presentation or about the status? All right, and so next it's public comment. So are there any members of the public that would like to speak?
We have 2 sign-up sheets, one specific to public hearing that nobody has signed up. We do have public comment on the regular agenda. We have 2 names on there that say maybe. But
Okay, well, let's start with the public hearing. So for the presentation we just heard and for the status on middle housing and ADU code amendments, is there anybody who would like to speak? All right. So next, staff addresses questions. We haven't had any. So unless anybody else would like to speak on public hearing, we will adjourn the public hearing. Is there a motion to close the public hearing?
I motion to close the public hearing.
There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Public hearing is closed. All right, so next we have public comments, and so there's 2 on the sign-up sheet. We can start with the first, and of course, if anybody else would like to speak, we can welcome public comments as well. So do any of the maybes want to speak? Who's the first one, Mark?
Well, would you like me to approach?
Please.
So can you elaborate on the tier 3, what that means? And how big the lots need to be able to build those type of structures and whatnot?
Yeah, great question. And so, Kirsten, would you like to speak to that? So the question is, can we elaborate on tier 3? What is the definition of tier 3 and what is the lot size? Is there a minimum lot size before middle housing can be permitted on a lot in tier 3? Is that the question? Terrific.
And thought I'd just bring this slide back up. Let's see. So, yeah, so a tier 3, the state came up with these different definitions. A tier 3 city is one that is within a contiguous urban growth area with the largest city. The county it is in has a population of more than 275,000 people, and the population of the city itself has less than 25,000. So the state came up with these different tiers in terms of what would be required. So when you look at the other slide, let me get to it. They're stating that if you're a tier 3 city, you can reasonably build 2 units per lot. If you were a tier 2, you'd be required to allow for more types of middle housing units within your residential zones. And if you're a tier 1, you'd have to allow all 9 types, and those include triplexes, 4, 5, and 6 plexes, and townhomes. And so what a lot of these smaller communities have found was that when they were trying to require 4 units or more be allowed per lot, it wasn't always doable. So the state came down to saying, well, these are the types of housing units that you could build and still fit in 2 units. So with the duplex, you can easily see that. Courtyard apartments, it's typically where you've got a courtyard in the middle and the housing kind of goes around it in a U shape. You can still do that with a 2 unit configuration. It's just kind of unusual. They're just attached. It's turning. And then the cottage apartments, or cottage housing is essentially 2 cottage housing units on the property, and you have to have a common open space on the property. And they've restricted that to 20% open space, and then you usually have shared parking as well. Stacked flats are a little bit different to where it's going to be a unit on top of another unit. And typically that would only work if you're going to be renting 1 unit, or you need to go through the condominium process if you're going to sell off a lot. In terms of when it's applicable, it's really going to come down to each lot being assessed individually to determine whether you could actually fit another unit on there or not, meeting your current development standards for whatever the zoning district is. You've definitely got some, when you look at the code, for instance, like page 28 of one of your packet agendas, it's got lot area. So I'm looking at, for instance, the RS 20 residential low, where it's a 20,000 square foot lot, and you have to have a minimum street frontage of 75 feet. And then you've got lot coverage of no more than 25% of the net lot area. And so each of the zoning districts has their own specifications described within the code. And so it'd be a matter of just working within the constraints of the existing code. Middle housing can't be more restrictive than if you're going to build a single family home on the lot. And so that's one of the very important requirements from the state. So does that answer the question, or do you need more clarity if I didn't answer it properly?
That answers. Thank you.
Terrific.
Okay, great.
And so the next person on the list is Nat Hopper. Terrific.
I'm good to go.
All right. Is there anybody else who had public comment?
Can we ask a question?
Please.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
I'm Carol Worthen. I just had a quick question. I think when I was reading through the draft, you guys were talking about increasing the allowable building height. Is that still in the works? I think it was going up to 40 feet potentially. When do you decide all those things?
So we will be proceeding later today to be making some hopefully final decisions on the code amendment.
Uh-huh.
I'm not recalling offhand if we said anything about raising the maximum.
I think
height.
that was one of the, like you had different scenarios in that draft document, if I'm not mistaken.
It
I
was
think
an
the
option to be.
Yeah, that was
considered.
one of the options they were looking at. That's what I'm getting at, is that when do you guys hash all that stuff out? And is there more room for public comment on things like that, or how does that work?
I think I know what you're getting at here. So one of the items in the packet was a recommendation from the consultants on
Mhm.
things we can consider
Right.
after we pass this first package
Why?
So this first package, we have to get to council pretty much as is, and it doesn't
Okay.
have any changes to heights and things like that. But
Right.
the
got it.
consultant report suggested a couple of different ways that we could take additional steps. So one might be heights. One might be what are sometimes called density bonuses, like, okay, if
Right.
you're going to build cottages, maybe you could do 4 instead of 2, right? But those are all going to happen after June
Got it.
from where we sit.
Yeah, I was
We-
wondering how you're gonna do all that in this short time frame. Now I understand it. Okay, thanks.
I think for me, one of the things that really helped was thinking about the comp plan as policy, which don't really tell you what you can or can't do. And it's the code that ultimately puts forth the rules. And we're required to have the comp plan updated, meaning all of our policies updated. And then our work is to say, okay, what does that look like in terms of a rules standpoint that govern building?
And just before the next public comment, for the first person who spoke, is it Tara Jorgensen? Terrific. Just wanted to make sure that was reflected in the minutes. Matt?
Just curious about the timeline or the code amendments act, is that end of 25, is it all the way through 26, is there some background for that?
Yeah, I think there is. And Kirsten, I think you had a slide on that for,
I really couldn't quite hear the question. I'm sorry, just because it wasn't. on my
is
microphone.
there a timeline for the immediate code amendments
Yes.
that
there-
that are being considered? Can you remind on what that timeline is?
Yes, absolutely. So for the tier 3 cities, and on this, they've delineated it by your location in the state. So the deadline for Lake Forest Park is June 30th, 2025 to adopt the new middle housing regulations in compliance with the RCWs that they've created. Communities that do not adopt it, they have drafted a model housing ordinance that will supersede what you have in place right now. And it's got different setbacks, different heights. It would be challenging to work with versus working within the confines of what you've already have in your code and what we've discussed over the last few months.
So the timeline we're working towards, and we've been kind of discussing this as Maddie mentioned, as part of the comp plan updates, and then following on from the comp plan updates, which we were working on for about, over the past year and a half. We have these code amendments. Our goal, I think, is to hopefully approve them tonight, and then they would go to city council.
And just to clarify, tonight, the agenda item is a recommendation to city council. Our specific city code requires a public hearing both at planning commission and city council for the ordinance. Depending on what happens here at planning commission tonight, it's just a recommendation. And if we're through with the recommendation tonight, we would move on to city council May 22nd. And then the better part of June for as much time as the council needs to hold a public hearing, likely June 12th, and then consider and potentially adopt these amendments. The work of the planning commission will not stop. They have a parking lot or list of potential incentives, items like frontage regulations that they'll continue that discussion for throughout the year.
Yeah, I guess to just maybe getting at what you're asking is some of these follow-up, additional code things. Those, right now, we're meeting the mandated state timeline for this first package of adopting middle housing regulations. But as Mr. Hoffman said, we have, some incentive issues, could be heights, could be density that we will work through, but we won't have a hard deadline unless the council gives us one to, refine, dive deeper into sort of specific types of further code work. So we don't have a deadline for those unless we're given one.
And actually, yeah, if you look at our meeting minutes from the year so far, we had a lot of discussion about how much we do right now in order to meet the minimum requirement. And I think we arrived at a pretty fair level of consensus to do the bare minimum that's required by state law. And not because there wasn't an appetite to look at other innovative opportunities we have, but to save those things as part of an incentive package for folks in the community. So anything we're doing right now, by and large, is to meet the state law And some of these other things like height and setback and, you know, other ways of thinking about this, we wanted to use those as much as carrots for getting the diversity of housing we hope plays out as a part of these changes to our state laws so that we don't, you know, just have this really monolithic housing inventory that gets put into Lake Forest Park as a result of the state laws that went into play. And so we're giving ourselves some room to explore what sort of incentives could encourage the kind of building we collectively as a community would like to see. So everything right now is a little more, wouldn't you say, Yanni, procedural, you know, to get ourselves in compliance so we're not having state model code language imposed upon us. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Terrific. So I think that's the end of public comments. Nobody else wanted to speak? Well, let's proceed then to report from our city council liaison.
Thank you so much. We've had a busy time since I was last here. So we authorized the mayor to sign an interlocal agreement for our water resource inventory area number 8, which is a Chinook conservation plan. We passed a couple of resolutions that I want to highlight that really reflect the Lake Forest Park values. And that is that the first one was the city is affirming our commitment to ensure that all individuals, regardless of gender identity, sexual orientation, or gender expression, feel safe and secure in our community. And the second one was a resolution affirming Lake Forest Parks and welcoming being an inclusive and safe community that sees that all of its residents, regardless of immigration status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, faith, race, national origin, age, ability, ethnicity, housing, state, or economic status, or other social status, are welcomed here in Lake Forest Park. And I think it speaks well to the values that Lake Forest has as an inclusive community, that all people are welcome in Lake Forest Park and should feel secure and safe here. So I was very pleased that the council passed that, those two resolutions. We also had some sort of basic homework. We authorized the mayor to sign an agreement with the Public Works Board for additional funding for a roundabout on Ballinger Way and Northeast 40th. We signed an agreement with Police Guild for the next 3 years to maintain our police force, which is we're very proud of, the police force here in Lake Forest Park. Director Hoffman, Safe Built permit services that we have ongoing right now with the loss of Calvin from our permitting department, and they're doing a fantastic job. And so we're very pleased to continue their services. Let's see. We also took up the sign code amendment twice in March and April, and we will take it up again this month, I believe. Do we have it?
Thursday.
Next Thursday. So if you have a moment, wonderful work that the Planning Commission has done. And so we're very proud of the work. There are some minor changes that we are adopting, clarification and others. And you may notice that I think there might be a push to remove the limitation on the number of signs that may be up temporarily on any one basis. You can imagine politicians want their signs. The other is I want to mention a dear friend and dedicated public servant, Councilmember Lori Bodie, passed last month. We're very sorry to see her go. And so we are starting the process to fill the vacancy on the city council. So I believe applications for a temporary interim city council member are due in 2 weeks from tonight. And we will begin the process thereafter of doing interviews. And this person would serve through the time period from roughly now until the certification of the election this fall. So as soon as it's certified, the winner of the position 2 in November, then that person will serve for Councilmember Bodie's remaining term. Are there any questions? So we encourage any and all those that wish to apply to do so. They have 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. So next it's onward to old business, and the first item on the agenda is now the middle housing and ADU development regulations amendments and a potential recommendation from us to the council. So the draft amendments were shared in the board packs, and Mark, how should we start? Is there a presentation from?
There is, and a little bit of background that I would add, and then Kirsten would continue with the PowerPoint. The little bit of background is a comparison to the work on the comprehensive plan going into December. It required a 60-day Department of Commerce review. For the comprehensive plan, that was very late in the process, but it did happen, and we were fortunate to receive their comments, address them, then hold a public hearing at City Council and incorporate them. This is a little different. We actually got the Commerce review comments 2 weeks early. And so that comment email is in your packet. SCJ was able to review them and suggest amendments for tonight that they would make it in this public hearing draft. And so you have that as your packet. We would like to very much focus on those in the next hour so that you understand their review comments, see the suggested amendments, and then potentially form consensus as to whether those amendments are appropriate. That would then be incorporated into the recommendation going forth tonight and begin as the starting point or working document at City Council. Whereas last fall, we didn't have Commerce comments until after we were at City Council. So that's the fortunate part. The last few weeks were spent on that. We are through with the 60-day review. It officially ended yesterday. Those are the comments that we have. The environmental review is also completed. So we're ready to go forward. No, I misspoke. The environmental review is out for public comment specific to the determination of non-significance. That will occur as we go into City Council and before the City Council public hearing. So that part's unfinished, but we've received no comments to date. And those comments would have to be specific to the environmental review, determination of non-significance, or whether an EIS is, or environmental impact statement is appropriate. Those are not comments on the actual amendment. So those can come forward as City Council. So that's the update I have. Then the rest of the presentation is preparation for any discussion questions that the commission may have, and open it up to a recommendation at some point.
Terrific. Kirsten, would you like to share then?
Yeah, so I'm going to share the PowerPoint again. We kind of broke it up into two parts. And we did the public hearing portion, and we're going to kind of dive into a few more details that you discussed last week with, or last month, or last time you met with Zoe. And just kind of a reminder and how it leads into some of the amendments that have been incorporated. But just kind of want to give a reminder of some of the subdivision requirements, and then also what's exactly, like, specifically included in your code, a summary of the code amendments, and then I've got some responses to the Commerce comments and how we responded to them. So just a reminder that the middle housing also took place at the same time as I'm updating the subdivision code, and the RCW, which was adopted as part of the middle housing laws for 1110, says that a city must allow 0 lot line short subdivisions where the number of lots created is equal to the unit density required. So your unit density right now we're focusing on is 2 units per lot. So since that's your density requirement, this means that Lake Forest Park must allow a 0 lot line subdivision where you take a single residential lot, you've got this parent lot here, and divide it into 2 lots. And it's kind of showing you 2 possibilities with a typical subdivision and then the 0 lot line subdivision. Well, I should say unit lot subdivision and 0 lot line. And then on the next slide, just a reminder of a different bill that was enacted in 2023 to update the State Subdivision Act, where it's requiring all cities to include short plat regulations for unit lot subdivisions. And this is essentially how you make it possible with your middle housing units and your ADU units to actually sell off land that goes along with that new unit. You've got a parent lot and you have to take the same configuration and you can divide it into 2 lots, but it's not your standard subdivision process per se. It's a unit lot subdivision. You still have to meet the density, the setbacks, all of that for your parent lot for the entire thing. You know, so you have to make sure you can actually fit a second unit on there. And in this particular scenario that we've got on the screen, you would have to have access and utility easements to the second lot. And then you can also have all the parking for both units on one lot with the access easement portrayed there as well. So just kind of wanted to remind you how that works. And then here's how a unit lot subdivision can look. We are looking at the 2 units per lot right now, but just in the future, you know, you got your short subdivision where you divide into 4 or fewer lots. If you're doing 5 or more, this is a potential of how you could make something look where you've got access for these 3 lots. And can you see my arrow when I'm moving it around?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, make sure. So I'm on the one in the middle where it's showing the possibility for accessing 5 lots. And then you have a lot split where it's a little bit different scenario. So we're just giving you some examples of how this could play out depending on the number of units. But right now, once again, we're sticking with 2 units per lot. Delving into just a summary of the code revisions, we're adding new terminology, a lot of new definitions. The ones in red are ones that are mandated by the state that you absolutely have to include in your code. So we've got those incorporated. They recommended adding tier 3 city and unit density. And so we did incorporate those. And then we also updated the definitions for ADU attached and detached and for multifamily. And then we've added these to the use chart. So this next one here, uses added, updated, that's like what uses are allowed. It's not necessarily a use chart in your community, but each of your zoning districts states what's allowed. So we're now allowing those 4 different types of housing units, but you also have side-by-side duplex. So that's why you've got 5 listed, just for clarity on the different types. And then another proposed revision, I should say several revisions, as to the ADU section. And it's all just following along with House Bill 1337 and the accompanying RCW. So basically, we're now stating within that part of the code that 2 ADUs are allowed for a single family home, but none are allowed on a duplex or other middle housing lot. New development standards that go in line with the RCW, that they're only allowed on lots that meet the minimum size requirements and have sewer connection. And they're not allowed on lots with critical areas. And I'll dive into that a little bit more in a bit. And then there's parking exemptions near transit stops. And then you can also allow for garage and accessory buildings to be converted into ADUs, except if you're taking the actual garage space and eliminating parking that's required for the principal structure, you have to replace the parking. And then what's newly added, and I'll get into this a little bit more later, after we got the comments from Commerce, they said they wanted to see something that said that condominium conversion of ADUs was allowed. So we've just added that as a provision. The code didn't prohibit it previously, but if they were recommending it, there's a statement to that effect. Then they also wanted us to add that ADUs can be sited at the lot line when abutting a public alley if it's not routinely snowplowed. So highly unlikely you're going to have that scenario, but they wanted it in there, so we put it in there. Just have some graphics for what ADU possibilities exist. So in this scenario, you have an internal attached ADU. So like back here, you've got like an outbuilding, like a garage, and you've got maybe an ADU on the bottom level or on the top. And then a detached ADU would be completely separated from the main structure. And this comes from MRSC's website, and they borrowed it from the city of St. Paul. And then you have an attached ADU where somebody would actually construct and build it on to the principal structure. Then moving on, some of the other proposed revisions, we've talked about this in the past, but we do need to incorporate some requirements that for the off-street parking requirements. The city can only require one parking space if the lot is less than 6,000 square feet. And you can only require 2 if it's greater than 6,000 square feet. Somebody could have more than that if they choose. You just can't require it more. And then this top one is just stating that no off-street parking will be required within 1/2 mile walking distance of a major transit stop. And then I shared the subdivision laws previously because it's leading to some updates to your subdivision code, where we're updating the definitions for subdivision and short subdivision, and we're adding new definitions for parent lot, as I showed you what that was: unit lot, lot split, unit lot subdivision, and zero lot line subdivision. And so 1712 is your subdivision chapter, and there's just various updates made to incorporate those terms within, and that you have the same procedures that you're going to follow for unit lot subdivisions that you would for a short subdivision. And then Mark, this is where we get to the comments from Commerce. And I put them all on one slide, but then after we talked, I actually was able to go in and show you what we did with those. And so for one of them, they said they had a comment about making sure that they recommend including middle housing types to ADU definition and removing subordinate and floor area to be more consistent with state statute. So on page 15 in your packet, it shows where we did this, where we modified the definition here and removed the part that says it's subordinate in floor area to a single family unit, dwelling unit. And then on this next comment that they had, that says section 1850-060 has a 15-foot setback from the rear property line. We recommend adding language that ADUs can be sited at the lot line, one abutting a public alley, if it's not routinely snowplowed. So we took care of that on page 62, whether that will ever happen or not, but we've changed that to add unless abutting a public alley, not routinely snowplowed. So honestly, the number of comments you got from Commerce was very minimal, and we were very pleased to see how few they were, and it was pretty simple to take care of what they had in there. You had another section of code that stated that you didn't require off-street parking within 1/4 mile of a major transit stop, and they just recommended changing it to 1/2 mile, and that we eliminated, I think we had already eliminated this section right here. So that was an easy fix to change it from 1/4 to 1/2. And then they said we did not find language allowing for sale by condominium, and we recommend adding that to 1850. So we had a couple comments in the document on pages 61 and 62. And at first we said, well, we're going to just leave that for council to decide, and you still can. And I updated that comment to just say that they're not currently disallowed, but we could just add this statement. So I looked at some other codes online and found one that Commerce had approved, and it simply said an ADU may be sold as a condominium unit or as a separate piece of property through the unit lot subdivision process. So it's just saying, it's just calling attention to you can do that. And then the next one was that they recommended reviewing the code to ensure any impact fees on construction of ADUs are less than or equal to 50% of those on a principal unit, but that doesn't apply in your community. So that was left alone. And then this one was regarding, they just wanted to make sure that the environmental and development review process was the same for middle housing as it is for your typical single family residential. And so it's already incorporated throughout. We'd already considered that. Your code, the way it's written, like I put an example here from chapter 1816 for R20 residential low. And basically it says that you have a permitted use, you have single family is permitted. And then we'd already discussed that we're adding all these other middle housing types. And then it goes on to just say, okay, for any of those uses, all the same standards apply, whether it's going to be your lot area or street frontage, or if you go on the next page, I only copied one page, you'd have your lot coverage and any of the requirements that apply, that'll just be the same per zoning district, regardless of the type. So that kind of gets to the conclusion of the Commerce comments. Mark, did you want me to address the ones from the Planning Commission?
Please.
That would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
He did forward me one where we got this comment. There was some questions about all of the requirements specific to ADUs really were plugged in just straight out of what was required from the RCW, but some of the questions were, and this came out of the email that was sent to me, it looked like it's being highly restrictive, where it's limiting ADUs to lots that meet the minimum lot size of the zone, and the other prohibits ADUs where a lot contains any critical areas. Want to know where they came from. Regarding the first, so, I mean, you may have already seen this. I don't know if you want me to read it all, but on the next slide, I just pointed out, it just comes straight out of the RCW, the one regarding the critical areas. So it's specific to ADUs and 1337. And then also because you have the subdivision requirements coming into play, there's certain restrictions about the lot size requirements are really just simply saying that you have to make sure that you're doing it on a lot that already meets minimum lot sizes. And that if you're creating any new unit lots, that you can actually fit it on the parent lot. So the language that we put into the ADU standards is it just comes out of the requirements for the combination of the ADU requirements and the subdivision requirements. And I can pull up, I didn't actually have time to copy that section, but we've already put it into 1850-050D where she brought that up. And so I can pull that section up if you want, but I do believe, oh, here we are. I was showing, this is an example from the last packet, why it was likely not caught because it was a really messy track changes chapter where we added a little bit more where we talked about in here, the ADUs shall only be allowed on lots that meet the minimum lot sizes for the principal unit under the code. So if you have a single family home already, it just means like you have to meet whatever your minimum lot size is in that zoning district. In addition, for any lot which is the result of a subdivision or a lot split and which is below the minimum lot size for the zone, you wouldn't be able to have additional dwelling units. So you're going to have scenarios in your community where you're going to have some lot splits that you have lots that don't meet your current lot minimums, but this is just a way of addressing it. And then the other one was right here, the accessory dwelling unit shall not be allowed on any lot that contains critical areas or buffers or that is not connected to a public sewer system. So those were combined, but that just comes straight out of the code. And that actually changed from the original guidance where I believe Commerce used to, whoops, it went away, but they used to say that if you had even a portion of the critical area, you might be able to build on a part of it, but they just eliminated that altogether. And I'll stop sharing there, but I don't know if anyone needs any further clarification on any of those. I can pull this back up if you need to, or if you have new questions that have arisen from what I've shared.
I'd like to go back to those two you were just talking about related to ADUs. First of all, what you just said at the end there, that Commerce just went back to the original, if it touches a critical area, then I don't understand that. This commission has been really consistent in saying that for middle housing, we're not going to say you can't do middle housing just because you have a fraction of critical area. What we've said is we intend for the critical area protections to remain in place and not be compromised by middle housing. Why would we say something more strict for ADUs? That's not consistent with what we've been saying. We've been saying that this type of housing is okay as long as we meet all the requirements of our tree code, our critical areas, and everything else. Here, we seem to be treating ADUs more strictly than what we've said about middle housing. So I wrote those comments. That's why I'm
Oh, no, that's great.
clarify my point. And on the other, about the minimum lot size, I really struggle with this because the majority of Lake Forest Park was annexed after many, many decisions had been made under county code. And for example, in my neighborhood, which is RS 15,000, so big lots, well, in our neighborhood, about half the lots are smaller than 15,000 because they predate annexation. Now, they're not tiny lots. And to say that, okay, none of, 50+% of those lots can't have an ADU because we're not meeting a 15,000 square foot minimum, I'd really like this commission to come up with a better recommendation than that going forward, because that's just, that to me is against the purpose of the RCWs around, trying to increase housing. And it doesn't really pass the, kind of the eye test. Now, if we were to say, I think what's our smallest single family type zone? What's 7,200? Is that right? Is that our
Well-
smallest minimum lot size, something like that? Maybe if we tied it to, for a lot that's smaller than that, we won't allow ADUs. I could maybe get behind that. But honestly, I think should be more case by case, and we should not have a blanket rule like that. It takes a huge number of lots out of the possibility of having an ADU.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. So, I hear what you're saying, Yanni, and you've been pretty clear about this and consistent. I thought what we had decided was that because the RCW allows us to exclude lots with critical areas from this requirement of allowing a duplex, that we were putting a pin on allowing any of this on lots that had critical areas until we could dive into incentives.
I did not think we landed there. I thought we landed on the principle that we do not want to undermine or compromise our critical area protections. I don't think it says in here anywhere that middle housing shall be prohibited anywhere where it touches a critical area. I don't think that's in
I
here.
I thought the
We-
RCW said you could exclude
We
properties that
could.
had, hold on,
We could.
hold on. That we could exclude properties that had critical area on there. Could you clarify that? Was that a misunderstanding?
This one was for just simply ADUs only, not
No,
necessarily.
I know, but I'm just talking about Yanni's premise about that we
Yeah,
are
and
going to allow middle
The
housing
notes I
on.
have from your last meeting were that you had decided to not do that for those that had shoreline, which is a little bit different than critical areas. So we probably do need to do a little more deep dive into this, and I'm gonna pull up the,
In other words, we weren't saying we wouldn't endorse middle housing on lots that had critical areas, but we were going to wait, if we're not required to, that we would keep those out so that we had more incentives to offer.
okay. Let me see what kind of notes I've got. from-
Now,
And
didn't
if
the
I'm wrong and you
legislature-
guys voted, that's great, but I know that's been your position, Yanni, but I didn't know if we had all agreed that we wanted to.
So Mark, are you able, do you have a recollection of that while I look up the notes?
I do.
Okay,
What's your recollection, Mark?
Through the chair, everything up till tonight was a straw poll consensus to get through and frame the amendments as currently proposed and offered for the recommendation. Middle housing would be subject to the critical areas regulations, but there is no provision in this draft that prohibits middle housing from any parcel that has critical areas or buffers. So the two that are cited are for accessory dwelling units. And we've read the RCW, it's an option. And so we could soften that. They would still be subject to tree regulations, still be subject to critical areas, but this would not preclude them if you were to remove it. If you left it, then you could look at accessory dwelling units as part of the incentives,
Right.
because this would prevent it for that time period. Or you could add something with consensus tonight
Mhm.
to do this similar with middle housing.
Right.
Back at that point in time, that was not the consensus.
Okay, I'm missing this part, Mark. Are we required by state law? I thought there was, state law said any parcel that has critical area on it could be excluded from middle housing.
I believe the legislature revisited that question last year because they got a bunch of pushback and they said, no, that's not what we mean. What we're saying, you can exclude critical areas within lots from middle housing, which I absolutely support. But the legislature revisited this last year and changed their guidance. And I think that's what we went with our consensus recommendations so far, which is that we're not saying no to middle housing just because there's critical area on a lot. That's
Correct.
my understanding of where we are today.
That's how we got to today.
Yeah.
Okay.
The reason being was that while we started this at the policy level, the legislature was already processing a cleanup bill. And ADUs, middle housing, it's now captured in guidance as a grouping of
Mm,
legislation. So it's changed over time. Either way, it's just guidance.
okay.
As this pertains to accessory dwelling units, you could choose not to do these two provisions. You can have an accessory dwelling unit, therefore, on a lot that has a buffer, but you would still be subject to the critical area regulations. You could not have an ADU in the buffer. So
Right.
that's where if you remove these two sections, accessory dwelling units would stand going into city council review. As it stands right now, those provisions do not exist for middle housing.
Can I ask one follow-up question, just playing that out? For lots that are completely encumbered in our community, what will be allowed moving forward on those properties?
And everything is subject to application in the field. What's clear is they would need a reasonable use exception, RUE, to get a minimum development right. What's not clear until we actually go through the hearing examiner, what that specific minimum development right is for that lot. The city will argue at that point that a small, single residential, low density structure is the minimum development right, not a duplex, not a small residential primary structure with two accessory dwelling units.
So whether we would change this piece with the ADU that Yanni has brought up, or save that and use it as another carrot in incentives, either way, it won't undermine our ability to be mindful of parcels that are completely encumbered.
No, it will not.
Thanks.
And so I guess the question for Kirsten is, so Yanni had brought up kind of two different provisions. Can we consider them separately, or are they the same? Do they
They're
need?
separate, and you know, trying to dig into the background on this, I mean, you can, as has been said, you can choose to allow the ADUs on lots that do have the critical areas, but I think that you'll want to leave the other one alone. Because to have a substandard lot and then try to add new units, it just doesn't work. So they're very different.
So should we consider them separately? Yanni, which would you like to? Say?
I mean, I think they are separate, and I anticipated we might need to treat them a little bit differently. I mean, to the first one, meaning the critical areas one, the reason I would like to strike that is because given where we are today with middle housing in our language, I don't think we should be treating ADUs more harshly than middle housing when it comes to presence of critical areas. So I would like to strike that one. So if we want to handle that one first, I would move that we strike that language. I have it marked somewhere, but you probably have it up.
Yeah. And Kirsten, by chance, are you able to share on screen just the relevant portion that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I can.
Thank you. I think it's page 61 of the red line, just so we can look at it. So
Yeah, this is
the-
subpart E of 1850-050 E. My recommendation is that we strike.
So Yanni's motion is to strike from the draft subpart E of section 1850-050. Is there a second for that motion?
Can I actually, before we second, I'm sorry. I forgot that this included this piece about sewer. I don't have a problem with requiring a sewer. So what I would like to strike is the critical areas provision here. So in other words, what I'm saying is I think it's appropriate for us to say no ADUs if you're on septic. That's a water quality issue. It's, so my comment is specific to the critical areas, not the sewer. So if that's the only place where the sewer piece is contained, then I'd be happy to leave that in the language. Thank you.
So to clarify, the motion would be to strike in subsection E, the 7 words that contains critical areas or buffers or.
Yeah, correct. Thank you.
Is there a second to that motion?
Well, what's the consequence if we do not go with this proposal this evening?
So as I understand it, the consequence would be, as Yana has framed it, middle housing that is not an ADU can be put on lots that have small portions or large portions that have critical areas, as long as the critical areas requirements and development standards are met. But
Yeah.
ADUs would not be permitted on those lots. So a
Right.
duplex would be permitted, a small ADU attached or detached would not.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about like what? So an ADU, well, I guess we could, I'm just kind of trying to put this in my mouth through my mind, like what are the unintended consequences if we go with this with this provision? I'm not opposed to it necessarily. I'm just trying to think about like what, and on the ground, you know, when the city is attempting to, somebody comes over and says, hey, we want to put, you know, I'm just not, there's just something that I can't articulate that I'm concerned about.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really fair because once we do it, it's hard to rein it back in. And that's my
Exactly.
feeling is if we're not required to by law, I take Yanni's point about consistency. I think that is really sensible. But then I wonder, is it one accessory dwelling unit or two accessory dwelling units? Because they're both allowed. And we're also talking about that they can be sold. And there are all of these other things that it feels like in this time and space, we haven't had an opportunity to unpack. So it might not be consistent for a time, but it could be something we pick up when we have this space to sort of figure out where we want to put incentives and how we want to adjust our code once we have a chance to weigh what those unintended consequences might be, and to be clear about, is it the maximum number of accessory dwelling units, or is it just one, or, you know, I agree with you. I think until we have a chance to really think about what the longer tail is of that change, there's nothing forcing us to do that tonight.
So
Can I
before we debate further, is there a second to the motion for Yanni's motion? I will second Yanni's motion. So I guess then, Yanni,
can
would you
speak
like
to
to
it.
speak again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental, the unintended consequences, people who would have liked to build a small ADU will instead build a duplex because they get to do that under this new code. So the unintended consequences, we probably will have bigger structures being built in these areas that have critical areas on the lot than you would under an ADU. So to me, that's not sensible or consistent with how we've been talking about the role of middle housing and critical areas. And we're suddenly now saying, but we're going to make it even more strict on ADUs. That doesn't make sense. The other thing that maybe our consultant or director can speak to, as I recall at one of our winter meetings this early spring, we were basically given guidance from the state that said, you know, the minimum you must allow, okay, is either a duplex or a house with two ADUs, one detached, one not, right? So those are kind of our choices. And now we're saying, oh, but if you choose this one over here, you can't do that in critical areas, but this other one, you can. I don't think we're sending a consistent message. I think if anything, the unintended consequences are negative from the perspective of those who are worried about, you know, too much or different types of development in their neighborhood. Thank you.
And through the chair, staff can give some context about unintended consequence. The E that we've been referring to is a subsection of an RCW section 5. That section reads, nothing in this section or in RCW 36.70A.681 prohibits or city or county from, and then you go A, B, C, D, and E. We've been reading E, accessory dwelling unit on a site that has less than the minimum lot size by code or a critical area. So it's blanketly saying you have the choice to permit middle housing accessory dwelling units, but a choice to say, if you have a critical area, you flat out can't do it. The unintended consequence is that by our existing code that would apply either way, whether this was in here or not, defines critical area as the steep slope, the stream, the erosion area, plus the associated required buffer, plus the associated setback. So by leaving this in here now, someone would come to my office, say, I would like to do an accessory dwelling unit. I would see E, I would ask for a critical area study. If any portion of that lot had a critical area buffer or needed a setback, this would preclude them from doing an accessory dwelling unit. End of story. Whereas if this were taken out, the critical area regulations would determine whether an accessory dwelling unit could be constructed outside the critical area of the buffer and the setback. What is often missed by a homeowner or a contractor is that the critical area includes the buffer and the setback. It needs to be shown. And so this would, by definition, preclude accessory dwelling units. At the same time, we're mandated and are trying to encourage them.
So to Yane's point, hypothetically, if you had a 20,000 square foot lot and it had a 2,000 square foot house on it, and it had 1,000 square feet critical area setback and buffer, assuming tree canopy, assuming development standards, if this is in here, they can't then build another 1,000-foot attached or detached ADU. But if this is taken out, they could, assuming that that critical area was protected and all the setbacks and the tree canopy and all the rest of it were addressed.
That's how staff reads the RCW. The guidance is guidance and it's trying to merge many things at once. And it's pointing to RCW, which says it's an option for a city to choose in regard to accessory dwelling units. And so as written, the amendments are choosing that.
Right.
But Lake Forest Park is very different than a lot of cities. There are a lot of critical areas. There are a lot of existing lots that are already under the minimum lot size. So it is a implementation choice to implement policy that may not be consistent. If the policy in the comprehensive plan says, let's encourage, find ways, promote accessory dwelling units as a housing choice, which is not middle housing, this would be more restrictive than that policy intends.
So the reason I had seconded Yane's motion is his and Mark's kind of statement of kind of our discussion over the past year is consistent with my understanding. I thought that we were aligned in principle that we weren't going to exclude any lots from middle housing. And I view, even though they're different, I view kind of ADUs as part and parcel of the type of diverse housing, you know, the law requires and that we're trying to encourage for affordability. I don't think it should be disfavored or treated any differently. And I remember from a couple months ago, we had that very protracted discussion about, you know, what choice are we going to do? Are we going to allow, you know, 2 units of middle housing per lot, or, you know, a principal unit, 2 ADUs, or are we going to allow both? You know, there was some ambiguity about, do we have to allow both? And we made a decision, no, we're going to allow either or. You can pick, you know, 2 ADUs in a principal unit or 2 units of middle housing. But I had understood that to be consistent with what we have talked about for, it seems like more than a year now, that as long as, you know, critical area and tree canopy and all the rest of the requirements were addressed, we weren't going to say you couldn't do middle housing in this area, or you couldn't do an ADU in that area. So that was the reason that I seconded the motion to strike, and I'm in favor of striking it. But is there anybody else who hasn't spoken who would like to speak on the motion? Yes.
I have a question. So we did ADU policy in the past and it was, you know, really thought through well. So do these items make building that more restrictive than we had in the past? Is that your frustration, Yanni, is that these are kind of unintentionally making it more restrictive than even we had previously?
I mean, I was not on commission when the ADU code was last handled.
Mhm.
So I don't know all the discussion that went on there, but these look to me like these are new additions. So yes, I would say it is
So
more
you could
restrictive
have
than today.
built one previously and now these would prohibit that from happening.
Correct. Currently, accessory dwelling units, 1,
are permitted by right. And then the question was, well, why aren't we getting any? Why are we getting 1 or 2 a year? Well, they're very expensive, but they are subject to critical areas, and there's a lot of buffer and critical area in the city. And so the policy was developed to promote accessory dwelling units. This would work against that policy. Right now, you can build an accessory dwelling unit if you meet the tree ordinance, the critical areas and so forth, but you only get 1. Now these rules come along, now you get 2, and they don't have to be owner occupied, and you could sell them. But the policy still says the city would like to see more of them.
And I'll also say, Yanni, I did not recall that the state had, is now requiring us to allow middle housing on lots with critical areas. And so what I didn't want to do is actually forego any opportunities, but to have more incentives to work with. But if we are in fact being required by the state to allow middle housing on a property with critical areas, I agree with you, Mark, that we have other policy in place, other code in place that protects those conditions. So I'm not opposed to striking it if we're having to do that by law, but if we don't have to do that by law with middle housing as it first came out, then I'd like to hold all that back for incentive.
And it's hard to look back. There's been so much legislation and guidance and amendments.
Yep.
And so I cannot quote the original. Originally, there were escape clauses in 1181.
Yeah.
Options for cities with critical areas are 75%. So
Right.
we did not take those options.
Yeah.
And now we incorporated those policy. And so there may be some thought as to critical areas and those options related to comp plan.
Yeah. I also want to point out the logic behind this too could be applied the other way around. If we're required to allow 2 ADUs per lot, plus the primary house, that's 3 living units on a lot. We're also in another area of the code saying that it's okay to sell an ADU under a condo association, which in effect, you could say, well, we're being inconsistent. We're allowing a primary residence and 2 ADUs on a lot. They can all be sold and now become 3 separate homeowners. And yet on all of the other lots, we're only allowing, a duplex. And so I think some of these things are at odds, and I'm cautious about scope creep and saying, to conflate this and that, and, consistency, that argument for consistency could become a tail that we're chasing. And I again will say for the record here, I wish we wouldn't talk about density and we talk about diversity of housing, because our goal isn't density, it's to create a more diverse housing stock in our community, primarily defined by square footage. So anyway, I would be glad to also go with your recommendation, Yanni, if that's where the law went.
But I have to say, it's been a good conversation, right? Because I think I understand it much, both sides, right? So I appreciate that.
Now, before you go too far, staff would strongly suggest keeping the septic.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
That's a bigger issue. Yeah.
I think I would just not like to unintentionally take an option off the table for some property owners that they had and take that option away from them when that wasn't really what we were
The intent.
doing. And in addition, I mean, I was very for not going above what was required, but then I don't want to unintentionally take away an option that already was on the table for some property owners.
All right, so is there anybody else who hasn't spoken that would like to speak? If not, I'll call the vote. So all of those in favor of the motion to strike from the section here on the screen, section 1850-050, subpart E, to strike the words "that contains critical areas or buffers or," please say aye.
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 All those opposed? Anybody abstaining?
Abstain.
Terrific. All right, well, the motion carries and we'll strike that from the draft.
Can I speak to the second?
Yeah,
The
please.
second issue. So this is subpart D in that same area. So accessory dwelling units shall only be allowed on lots that meet the minimum lot sizes for the principal unit under the code. And then there's more there about subdivision. So this one is a little, it's not as clear cut, but this is one I would like to see on the parking lot at least. Because we have such a breadth of minimum lot sizes here that there's not, in my view, an environmental, ecological, hydrological justification to have this as a blanket rule in all our zones. So for example, you're in R20, so 20,000 square foot minimum lot size. And let's say you have 19,500, you're not allowed to have an ADU. That just, it kind of goes against, I think, what the legislature is trying to guide all cities to do, which is to, look at your housing stock, look for opportunities, allow more unit count, do it in sensible ways. So to me, there probably is a size or, there's probably some threshold that maybe it does make sense. But those of you who remember the memo I wrote about the frontage requirements, I zoomed in on some neighborhoods. I zoomed into my own neighborhood. I live in RS 15,000. It was only annexed in 1999, and every lot split that was done there, there probably haven't been any since it was annexed by the city, but the city said, we shall make this RS 15,000. Over half the lots are smaller than that, but they're mostly in the 10,000 range. So why are we saying no to ADUs on lots that size in a first ring suburb? This whole, we're attached to Seattle, So I don't know what the magic number is. There probably is one or some other set of criteria we would use, but I think, I don't approve of this in here, but I don't have a clear answer or an alternative until we dive into it more deeply. I would love to see staff crunch the numbers for us. How many parcels in each of our zones are actually substandard already? And again, most of that happened in the 90s, 80s, 70s. It's not, things that got subdivided now and now people are trying to take advantage. Most of this happened before it was part of Lake Forest Park.
So I would feel comfortable putting this on the back burner, because I do think this entails a lengthy conversation. It's 8:13, and I think that our intention is to vote on the recommendations that go to the city. So I'm not opposed to this idea. I just think let's put it on the back burner. That's what I propose.
And it's not new language, I don't think, right? This is what's been in our code for some time, if I recall correctly.
For ADUs, this looks new in that it's like underlined as a new insertion, but staff can maybe respond to that. I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, let's look at that because I do remember when we were working on the ADU code, part of the intent for this language, if my memory serves me correctly, was to prevent people subdividing and then saying, "Oh, look, because I'm now subdivided, I can build on it because I've got this parcel." So it was more to keep people from subdividing a lot and then enjoying the benefits of that they wouldn't have been allowed otherwise. It's a little, I'm a little vague on it, but I do believe this is existing language. And I would also have a question about whether or not, much like what you were saying, Mark, with our critical areas ordinance, if because I can go both ways with this, but I'm with David. I think we've got a lot yet to cover tonight. I would be really curious to know if existing code addresses any concern with this item, meaning you have to have a certain percentage of your lot as pervious. And so that really is probably the bigger, more important issue is that you meet the minimum requirements for pervious surface on your lot and your setbacks and your height restrictions and so forth.
Yeah, we're not suggesting or recommending any changes to that. So regardless of the use, primary, duplex,
Right.
you need to meet those standards.
Minimums. And so that may be
37,
enough. Yeah.
35%.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, it's a big clause that it might be nice to unpack later.
Yeah. And then the question for the parking lot incentives and later is, do the 35%, 45% lot coverage impervious surfaces work for middle housing plus 2 ADUs?
Right.
We're not at that point.
Just a quick clarification. I'm looking at the current code and it has some language related to a breakpoint of 10,000 square feet. So I'm looking at 1850-050C. Accessory dwelling units on lots less than 10,000 square feet in area must be attached. So it's not even saying no, it's saying they have to be attached. But then except on lots between 7,200 and 10,000, something about how you can, as part of remodeling, you could include a detached accessory unit, so on and so forth. So it does sound like this was discussed, and it sounds like even under 10,000 feet, you could have one if it was attached. And so this kind of, to Meredith's point, if we do what's in this new language in front of us tonight, we're actually rolling back what people can do, potentially. Because this part of the code does not refer to whether it's meets the minimums. It's saying 10,000 square feet is kind of this interesting breakpoint for what you're allowed to do. So if we struck what I suggested striking, we still have this current code, which makes a, breakpoint for lots smaller than 10,000.
So you're saying if we kind of struck D and reverted to what we have struck here on the screen as C and D, which are part of the current code.
Correct.
So I just want to be sure I understand. So you're saying we should keep our current C and D and strike the new D?
I think that's right. I mean, yeah, I'm seeing that's right. They've struck out the section that's in there now and instead went to a stricter requirement.
Kirsten, do you have any more kind of insight into kind of the thinking behind the striking of C and D and the insertion of the new D? Because I may have missed, but I don't remember us discussing this before.
I honestly would have to check in with Zoe. She and I have been working on this one together. I do feel like, however, like this first part of the new D is a little bit different than what you've got going on with the second part, the in addition. For any lot which is a result of a subdivision or a lot split and which is below the minimum lot size for the zone, no additional dwelling units, including ADUs, shall be allowed. And that gets at, I apologize, I don't remember which commissioner was talking about that previous conversation about the unintended consequences of the subdivision lot split. Now, this is language some other communities are incorporating in, and that might have been why it was inserted in lieu of what you previously had in here.
I think on that point, I do recall some months ago, we discussed, a concern, and perhaps I expressed the concern where, to your point, Maddie, we wanted to be mindful of with kind of the subdivision requirements, not having a lot subdivided and then subdivided again and then subdivided again. And all of a sudden you can put 2 or 3 units on each of those lots, which seemed counter more than what was required by the law and counter to where we were at in the process of trying to hew closely to doing the minimum at this point and reserving.
Didn't we solve that issue by saying that either you could go with the middle housing or the ADU, but not both? Or I think we have language like that.
Yeah, I don't know if that's solved for the separate kind of overlay of the more permissive, you can now divide your lot.
Yeah.
But I'm not remembering exactly. So I guess the decision we need to make is, do we want to keep what's on screen here as D? Or do we want to revert for the time being back to the current code language, which is perhaps in C and D? That's stricken on the screen.
And looking at C, I would say if you're gonna keep that, you might want to consider the portion about it must be attached. Maybe you keep that stricken. the accessory dwelling units on lot, because you're concerned about the smaller or maybe even, I don't know, lots less than 10,000 square feet, but you were also discussing the concern over the larger lots.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want, anyway, I don't know that you want to keep the must be attached portion of that.
I think that's fair.
So I mean, we
Um,
don't have a motion on the table at this point. Can we just get a sense of, maybe informally, are people inclined to keep what we see on the screen, which would be an edit to the current code on C and D? Or are people inclined to revert to what we currently have in C and D and to strike the new D? I mean,
Or
who's-
could we just flag it for council and just say, this is an area?
we've certainly done that before.
With the question to the consultant, why the change for D?
Yeah. And it sounds like we're not going to have that answer tonight because Kirsten would need to talk to Zoe about the rationale here.
And I honestly feel like D could be split up into two different sections, but really quickly, let me point out one other thing with number 2 here. If you wanted to keep that, you probably need to still strike the height of the subject accessory building, because you can't restrict the height. You can't say it has to be allowed to be the same height as the principal structure. So that's just another piece you'd want to cut out, but potentially leave the rest of 2. And then I do think that we would want to do a little more thought about the lot splitting piece and have that maybe stay in there, where if you were to get rid of the first sentence in D, that would take care of your concern over the minimum lot sizes. Because you do have some very large lots. So, yeah, my recommendation would be, if you keep this, oh, I'm not in Word, you'd want to remove the attached part, and then you'd also want to, you'd have to eliminate this section here too, because you can't have a different height. And then potentially you could get rid of that, but then you might, this is where you want to have some conversations about lot splitting and unintended consequences. So there's a few pieces there.
So I'll just throw out an option then of what we might do, given the time and the goal on getting this, hopefully, with a recommendation today. To Yane's initial point, I say we flag this as something that we look at, in the parking lot. Maybe mark, for our next meeting, if there's a way to get any, initial kind of insight into what percentage of our lots or what lots do we have are kind of below, the minimum lot size, that have a principal unit that are, I don't know if that's something that the planning department would have an analysis on.
Well, I encourage that data will not exist in the next 2 months.
Fair enough. So we probably won't have the insight there, but maybe we flag this, with a comment for council saying we've kept the recommended updates, because we are, we were curious about, the impacts of removing them. We didn't have the rationale completely in front of us. We were concerned about the subdivision, piece, but we aren't sure that this is the right approach, and we'll be looking at it further, and hopefully by the time this gets to council, we could have from SJC a little more insight about the rationale. If you're able, Kirsten, to talk to Zoe and come back to us, but then at least we can still get to a recommendation tonight, and we have some language to propose. I don't know how that sits with people, or if people have another proposal for how to
Well,
resolve.
I thought I would just propose that to Kirsten's point, that for the current language that's being proposed for D, that we do split it into 2 parts and then flag it so that they're separated for council to see, because I do see the point that she's making, that if we start striking attached and height and so forth, that it kind of doesn't serve much of a purpose. It's whether it's on something less than 10,000 square feet or larger than 10,000 square feet, we're saying it's got to follow all the rest of the code. And so, yeah, I think my proposal would be to split the current language for D into 2 points and flag it for council to say we're a little, nervous as to whether or not this actually is accomplishing what we want it to accomplish.
So would you like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to take the language that is currently expressed in item D and split that into 2 points and flag it for council for further review.
Is there a second to the motion?
I second it.
I have a question about the motion. So what are we doing with the C that's existing language that's still stricken? If we're going to study something, I'm a little hesitant to say we're ready to strike all of C.
Oh, I was looking at it based on what Kirsten said, if she'll go back to that page.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to,
It looks like it's kind of pointless once we take out the attached or detached, because the whole purpose for C and D was to distinguish between lots that were under 10,000 square feet and lots that were over. And she just said we needed to take out the requirement for attached and the height piece, so it doesn't seem like it really even says anything useful.
Got it. Okay.
and I honestly feel like that's why this was struck altogether. It's just there's things in here like referring to this old ordinance 1235, parts of it that don't apply, but I can understand the concern with D. And we'll flag it, and I'll talk to Zoe I know that there was conversations at previous commission meetings that she can speak to that about.
Okay, so we
Is
have
there
a-
anyone else who would like to speak on the motion? All right, so all of those in favor of the motion, which would keep the current language in D, it would split it into 2 parts. So it would be a new D and a new E with renumbering accordingly. And if you'd accept as a friendly amendment, maybe the second sentence would just
Yeah.
read, it would delete in addition and start with 4.
Right.
So that it's a standalone sentence. So that is the motion on the table. All of those in favor, please say aye.
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 All of those opposed? All of those abstaining? Motion carries. Terrific. So we have a half an hour left in the meeting. Instead of going page by page through these edits, which I assume people have had the chance to do, what I would suggest doing is we would just go to any other questions or concerns that commissioners wanted to discuss. So that would be my recommendation, but if people would prefer, we could also go through all 75 pages, page by page. Does anybody have a preference? Can we stick with the recommendation on we just discuss any remaining concerns that people had? All right, well, let's do that. So does anybody have any other concerns with these draft amendments to the code? Concerns, questions, issues to discuss? And I'll give folks a moment if you want to refresh your recollection. I mean, I'll just say some of the Commerce Department comments seemed a little odd to me, but I don't see the problem with leaving them in. The stuff on alleys, we don't have alleys, but the stuff on the condos, your explanation, Kirsten, made sense. So I think we can just leave that in to address their concerns. And everything else to me seemed like something we've discussed before and seemed consistent. But I don't know if folks feel differently. And if not, when people are ready, just let me know and we could entertain a motion to approve these as our recommendation to the council.
I don't have it on my computer, but I was looking to see if they had adjusted any of the setbacks. I had made quite a few comments and was having trouble finding out if there were any.
Do you just want to ask?
Just a search, yeah. I guess, would you help me out since we don't have the paperwork right in front of us? If there were any adjustments to comments made on setbacks on side yards?
I don't believe we did, and I can go quickly to one of the sections of code.
And the primary reason for not doing so is that middle housing is intended at the existing bulk and mass.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, they've all remained.
Okay, thanks.
There's one part here where it just says that the existing setback requirements will apply for ADUs. Right. But it doesn't look like they were changed at all.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'll make a motion if there's no further discussion. I would move that we forward these recommendations to council as amended tonight. As a friendly addition to that, I think it'd be good for us to articulate what it is about that ADU thing that we want to, we're not sure what to do with it. The last section we just discussed, so the council understands what the questions were we were wrestling with. But with that, I'd move that we forward this recommendation.
A
There's a
second,
motion and a second.
second.
Just a question, for Mark, any concerns on your part?
It's easy to answer, it's hard to answer. I have no concerns with the amendments going forward to city council and being considered so that we meet the minimum mandates of the series of legislation. For everyone involved, this is a learning curve. It's legislative action, then policy, then implementation regulations, something new. There will be things that don't work because every jurisdiction is different. This is a very good framework or backbone for what we are required to do. It leaves opportunity for further investigation to incentives and exceed that for affordable housing options. It's likely that we will run into scenarios that we did not anticipate. There will be gray areas in this code, just like there are in our existing code. We will have opportunities to analyze those and suggest future amendments as cleanups as we go. So the easy answer is yes, staff's comfortable going forward.
Is there anybody else who would like to speak on the motion to approve these as our recommendation to council? All right, well, all of those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All of those opposed? And all of those abstaining? All right, motion approved. Thank you very much, Kirsten, and thank you, Mark. Thank you. All of your hard work on this. This has been great.
Thank you for your consideration tonight. It's a lot of hard work.
All right, so the next item we had on the agenda is discussion of our 2025 work plan items and prioritization. I don't know if we have a slide to share that, but it was certainly in the meeting pack. So I think that the outcome for this is, Mark, unless you have a different point of view, does this still reflect our work plan? Because do you need to update council on our work plan and whether this is still accurate, or is there something pending that we need to do formally to approve this as the work plan?
Thank you. The work plan is still the plan. This is one element, followed quickly at the planning commission level by the climate element. So there's one item of the three buckets. The climate policy advisory team is quickly framing a new climate element as a comprehensive plan amendment. That group will break up. It consists of members of all our boards and commissions, and they will go solicit feedback. All of that comes to the planning commission because the commission makes the formal review and recommendation and public hearing to the council. So that's that next category. Meanwhile, we can populate meetings with the prioritized items that you would like to look at, so that we can continue work on this parking lot while we're considering the climate element, thereby fulfilling the entire work plan by the end of the year. No, we won't get to every item in the parking lot. So I imagine. But that priority of what you want to see next, whether it's the frontage regulations or, that's kind of what the opportunity is, knowing that the climate element is at your doorstep.
And so the climate element, just to restate that, Mark, do I understand correctly? So the climate edits to the comp plan, they're gonna come by way of recommendation to our group and we will look at them? And then
Correct.
pass them on to council?
Yeah.
And in the work plan, it says by June 15th.
There are a variety of timelines. The primary timeline for me is the Commerce Grant. It's $500,000. The deliverables are designed to be handed to Commerce by June 15th. That way, by June 30th, we will have fulfilled the grant. The Cascadia contract runs through the end of the year. The process runs through the end of the year. So two separate things. So when you see June, that's when we need a deliverable number 10, which consists of a draft element. We are fast approaching that in the next 2 weeks. But the planning commission's work is to take that draft, consider it, adjust it, and start to frame a recommendation to city council and hold a public hearing. So you have plenty of time for that.
Okay.
It mirrors exactly what you did last year for the entire comprehensive plan. So you're well versed on that. This is just one element of, 11. So it's much more focused, but the same process.
Okay. So the remaining items on our work plan then are the climate element, as Mark just spoke to. We've also discussed and have approved on this work plan tools and incentives for middle housing affordability. We've discussed some of those topics tonight and obviously need some deeper discussion on that. I think the consensus of the commission was to do. And then we have these parking lot items, and there's a number of them. But that's what the work plan consists of. So doesn't sound like we need to make a decision on any of this tonight unless there's any questions or concerns about this work plan. Does anybody have any material concerns? Is there anything we're missing that we think we should be spending time on at this point? All right. Well, that's prioritization of the work plan items. I don't know, Mark, would it be helpful if we discussed kind of next month's agenda and how we want to address that in light of the work plan? Would that be appropriate?
It would. The next meeting of the Climate Policy Advisory Team is tomorrow night downstairs.
Okay.
We now have the survey's been done, the open houses have been done, the public participation. Now, and then we now have draft policies that have been given to staff for review and then given to the CPAC. That's tomorrow night. Where they go from there into June mostly informs what we hand Commerce on June 15th. So first week of June, they have their next meeting, June 2nd, I believe. If we're on track, that leaves an opportunity for us to start to inform the Planning Commission. So if that is the next primary thing, we could start to begin doing that in June. There wouldn't be much back and forth because it's more, it starts just like the comprehensive plan. It's a handoff. This is the effort, this is the background, this is where we're at, and please go read. So we could do that in June to start. July would be more critical because between July and December, we must adopt it and close it out of council. So the more we do early, the better. We were literally working up towards Christmas on the overall comp plan. It was getting a little worrisome, but we did it. This isn't so burdensome. So you have that opportunity to start in June or July, if you like, on reviewing what those draft policies actually are. If you remember back January, February, and March, when I first marched in here, those first 3 months with the comprehensive plan didn't have a draft document.
Right.
But we went to every commission, board, tree board, parks board, and said, this is what we're doing. Do you have input? Please read the existing plan. This would be similar. They would be more familiar with the existing plan. And the ask for them is please review these new draft climate policies as to how they fit into our new comprehensive plan. So we'll still do that same effort, but it's much more directed. If I can convey what those policies are, it's a much shorter task. They're numerous, 3 or 4 different categories or buckets, but it mirrors what we did 8 to 10 times last year. Each month it was, we need to focus on transportation. We need to focus on housing. You'll have several months to focus on the climate element.
Terrific.
June 10th is not critical in that effort, but it's available.
Okay. The other item from our priorities, which is the next item of old business, is a debrief discussion regarding affordable housing incentives. We've had some discussion about that. There were some materials in the board pack with some potential recommendations of what we might discuss and consider. Is there anything that people would like to discuss about that right now? I'd like to have a bigger conversation later.
What's that?
I think it probably
Oh,
merits.
sorry, I just said, I feel like it would probably warrants its own space, at
yeah.
another time.
I agree.
So I guess just informally for the next meeting, would people like to prioritize having discussion early on the climate element to the comp plan updates? Or would we like to prioritize discussion of the affordable housing incentives?
Can we do some of both?
It sounds like the climate piece is more time sensitive.
It is more time sensitive, it sounds like it, because this last one on affordable housing incentives, it's at our own timeline.
Right.
Yeah, that is the primary difference, but as far as time sensitive, the climate element is really July, August, September.
Right.
Comfortably at planning commission. October, November, December, city council. So yes, it's a timeline, but it's not nearly as quick as the effort last year. The affordable housing incentives is however long you would like to look at it until you frame one or more items or recommendation.
So would the commission be open then to perhaps we start with the discussion on the climate element? We get any early read on what that looks like and some early discussions so that going into July and August, we're a little more prepared and we're able to meet the timelines. And then on the second kind of main working part of the agenda for next month, we also start to have a debrief discussion about the recommendations that we've been given on affordable housing and where we might go with those.
I think that feels good.
Yes.
Terrific. Well, there you have it. That's
That
what we'd
works for
like to.
staff. The chair of the CPAD is here. And tomorrow night and June 2nd, the question I would ask the chair of the CPAD is comfortably, what does it look like for the breakup to go back to your boards and commissions? And planning commission is David's part.
So we're on track so far, but we'll know more tomorrow
Yeah.
evening.
And if we have to revisit, we revisit.
Exactly.
Exactly. All right, so new business. Is there any new business that people want to discuss? No, we haven't. So that's the one piece of new business is welcoming our new commission member, John Drew. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're so pleased to have you appointed to the commission and to be joining us.
You're here.
Thank you for welcoming me. I think that I would love to have coffee sometime with one or more of you so that I can get some kind of baseline information. I've missed the planning commission orientation, I'm afraid to say. So I'd like to just get up to speed and kind of approach it from the 30,000-foot level.
Well, terrific. Well, I'll certainly follow up with you on that. And
Right.
I'm sure other commissioners may reach out as well.
We will.
Good.
And just FYI, we can't all meet at one time. So we will have to meet with you one-on-one.
Great.
Well, public meeting.
Public meeting
rules,
rules, yeah.
exactly. Is there any other new business that people wanted to discuss? All right, so reports and announcements. Are there any reports and announcements from staff? Or from anyone?
None for staff, no.
All right, additional public comments. Is there anybody else who would like to make public comment? Do we have anyone online? I guess we don't do public comment online, do we?
Not any longer.
Not anymore. All right. We've aligned already on the agenda for the next meeting, so that's set. So unless there's anything else, we'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Before on anything else, Mark, are we still looking for one additional commissioner?
We are. Commissioner Kramer could not be here tonight, but in her email, she indicated the June meeting will be her last meeting.
So for anybody watching this or in the audience that might be interested in being part of this group,
And nominations
seat.
are through the city clerk and mayor.
great.
Perfect.
Otherwise, I motion to adjourn.
There's a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion and seconded. All those in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? All right, the meeting is adjourned at 8:47 PM.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.